I'm Stephen Gapps, President of the History Council of New South Wales, and I'd like to welcome you to the 25th Annual History Lecture. It's important to acknowledge here that what we now call New South Wales has always been a place of history for many Aboriginal nations. 25 years of history lectures is just a drop in the ocean compared to the long and deep history that has been part of the oldest continuous knowledge system in the world. And as writers, readers and lovers of history, we can draw strength and guidance from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, memory and ongoing histories. So I wish to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and custodians of the land and waters where we are all gathering tonight. Lands and waterways that sustained people for millennia that were taken from them without their consent and without treaty. The History Council has held an annual history lecture since 1996. It's become one of the Council's main events, with many incredible and passionate speakers over the years. This year is, for obvious reasons, slightly different. It will be the first time we have held an online annual history lecture, but hope that this will become a regular feature, reaching out across New South Wales and beyond. The annual history lecture was inaugurated by the Council to underline the importance of history in current issues and concerns. And I think, as tonight's lecture will undoubtedly show, at the present moment this is critical. The year 2020 has been momentous. We've seen bushfires that have devastated communities, protests that have inspired communities, and a pandemic that has brought about massive change to our lives. All these events have their origins in the past and have a bearing on the present. Rarely has history been so important. This year's History Week theme invites people to share why history matters to them. What, in such radical times, is history really good for? Before we begin tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales, without which our History Week Festival would not be possible, as well as our other cultural partners and History Week supporters, and in particular, the City of Sydney Council, who've assisted us to put this lecture on tonight through a Cultural Sector Resilience Grant. I'm honoured to invite someone to talk tonight who is not an historian with a capital H, but like many of us is imbued with the understanding of the importance of history in everything we do. You'll undoubtedly be familiar with Stan Grant, journalist, author, filmmaker, scholar, and Wiradjuri, Gamilaroi and Dharawal man. As we emerge from lockdown in what Stan calls these bleak and testing times, our world has been forever altered, but worse may still be to come. In tonight's lecture, Professor Stan Grant asks, are we condemned to ignore the lessons of history? Stan's journalism has led into a deep exploration of historical grievance and identity. His writing has focused on interrogating Australian identity and belonging. In tonight's lecture, Stan will talk about the context of this current pandemic in the broader political and historical picture, interrogating the language of virus as it has been used in the past, and focusing on what he calls a virus of tyranny that has connected authoritarianism and pandemics. So please sit back and enjoy what will certainly be not a typical history lecture we might expect, but will be an expansive, passionate, and undoubtedly interesting lecture from one of Australia's most inspiring figures.
We are living at a time of death. It is at our door. Death is a touch or a breath away. Death is twinned with fear, and that is its power. We know that death is inevitable, but it is imminent now, and that's what terrifies us. It is the fear of death that steals our life. That's what the French writer Albert Camus told us in his book, A Happy Death. It is the story of a man's search for happiness while confronting the meaninglessness of existence. As Camus wrote, he realized now that to be afraid of this death he was staring at with animal terror meant to be afraid of life. Camus told us that to conquer the fear of death is to truly live, yet most of us surrender to fear. Coronavirus and our response to it has stolen our lives. The mere threat or risk of contracting this illness has shut us down. We have sheltered behind locked doors, separated from those we love. The state rules our lives. Government-enforced lockdown has crippled our businesses, closed our schools, emptied our cinemas, music halls, and sports arenas. At times, to venture outside risks being punished, fined, or even jailed. This is not who we are. This is not how we are meant to live. Our societies are meant to be founded on freedom and liberty. The loss of liberty should offend us all. But fear has ruled over freedom. This year has left me deeply troubled. I bristle against control. I have seen where the loss of freedom can take us. As a journalist, I have spent much of my career reporting the most repressive and violent regimes on earth. And I know how easily and quickly peoples can descend into terror and tyranny. Even as I understand and accept that obedience right now is a virtue, that it may keep us and others alive and give us a chance of beating this virus, I also wonder if there is not something we should fear more than coronavirus. Because there is another virus, and it feeds on fear too. It is the virus of tyranny, and it is already loose in our world. Throughout human history, the virus of tyranny has laid waste to entire civilizations. It has shattered our treasures and obliterated cultures. It has come on horseback, set upon us by marauding armies. It has been carried in the air and on the seas. There is no vaccine against this disease. It sends us to war or condemns us to the gallows. Countless millions of lives have been sacrificed to this virus, and it will go on taking lives. We call it by many names: despotism, authoritarianism, autocracy, but its ends are the same: to create states of terror, to break our will and harvest what has been called a harmony of souls. In the words of Joseph Stalin, the production of souls is more important than the production of tanks. Human beings are weaponized in the cause of tyranny. Historian Timothy Snyder says Nazis and Soviet regimes turn people into numbers. I have chosen very carefully and very deliberately to link the spread of tyranny to the spread of a virus, because tyrants understand this deep primal fear we have of disease, and they use it to manipulate us and persecute others. They define their enemies as diseases or infections, and they seek to inoculate their own societies. Listen to them. Stalin's henchman, Vyacheslav Molotov, spoke of purging or assassinating people who, quote, had to be isolated, or he said they would spread all kinds of complaints and society would have been infected. The architect of Hitler's Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler, in sending millions to the gas chambers, said he was exterminating a bacterium, because we do not want in the end, he said, to be infected by a bacterium and die of it. He said, I will not see so much as a small area of sepsis appear here or gain a hold. Wherever it may form, we will cauterize it. And then there is Adolf Hitler, who compared himself to the famed German microbiologist Robert Koch. As Koch found the bacillus of tuberculosis, Hitler said, I discovered the Jews as the bacillus and ferment of all social decomposition, and I have proved one thing, that a state can live without Jews. To Hitler, Jewish people were, quote, no longer human beings. He described the Holocaust as a surgical task, Otherwise, he said, Europe will perish through the Jewish disease. Authoritarian regimes seek to sterilize and purify society. In Hitler's case, this focused on the purity of the German race. It is no mistake that they used the language of virus, disease, and contamination. Just as a virus is to be eradicated, so too people are to be removed, eliminated, or exterminated. These attitudes do not belong to a time past. There are leaders today who exploit the same fears, who focus on difference and create division using the same language of disease. Remember what Donald Trump said of Mexican immigrants, that they are responsible, in his words, for tremendous infectious diseases pouring across the border. In China, the Communist Party has locked up 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps, where human rights groups say they are brainwashed with Communist Party ideology. In an official party audio recording translated by Radio Free Asia, the Uyghur ethnic minority is described as being infected by an ideological illness. They must seek treatment from a hospital. The recording says, if we do not eradicate religious extremism at its roots, the violent terrorist incidents will grow and spread like an incurable malignant tumour. Albert Camus warned us of the virus of tyranny in his novel The Plague. It's the story of a rat-borne disease that overruns an entire city. His is a bleak vision of death and fear, of a city sealed off and a people locked down, shot when they try to escape. Written in 1947, just 2 years after World War II, when the West was still celebrating the victory of freedom, Camus' Plague is an allegory of authoritarianism. Camus wanted to tell us of the courage that swells within us, that when the plague was at its worst, brave people fought against it. But he cautioned us too that the plague can return. It is, he wrote, a bacillus that never dies or disappears for good. It bides its time, slumbering in furniture and linen. It waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, old papers, until one day it will rouse up again. In coronavirus, tyranny may have found the perfect host, a disease that brings the threat of death, a fearful population, and all-powerful government that can set aside all liberty to fight this unseen enemy. French philosopher Michel Foucault long ago made the link between the plagues of the 17th century and authoritarian control. Behind state-imposed discipline, he wrote, can be read the haunting memory of contagions. Not just the memory of a virus, but of rebellion, crime, all forms of social disorder where people appear and disappear, live and die. To Foucault, it is the state that brings order to the fear. Quote, everyone locked up in his cage, everyone at his window, answering to his name and showing himself when asked. In the response to the plague, Foucault saw the forerunner of the modern prison, the panopticon, the all-seeing eye. The plague-stricken village, wrote Foucault, is traversed throughout with hierarchy, surveillance, observation, writing. The town immobilized by the functioning of an extensive power that bears in a distinct way over all individual bodies. This is the utopia of the perfectly governed city. The coronavirus shutdown reminds us that freedom is indeed the province of the state. It can grant freedom, define its limits, or take it away. The crisis has centralized government control. Around the world, governments are using physical and biological surveillance to control the pandemic. Russia is using facial recognition to catch those violating quarantine. Drones and artificial intelligence is being used to spy on people. Social media shaming is used to out those breaking the rules. Tech giants Apple and Google provide government with access to the data of billions of people. Our freedom was unravelling before coronavirus, though. As part of the war against terrorism, Western democracies had already eroded civil liberties. In a growing number of countries, would-be autocratic strongmen had seized power. The rule of law and freedom of the media had been wound back. It was harder to tell where real news ended and fake news began. Technology had invaded our privacy. The virus of tyranny had already found its way into the bloodstream of liberal democracy. We have edged closer to what political scientist Vladimir Tismanianu has called the age of total administration and inescapable alienation. When we shut ourselves down, when we surrender our liberty, we can also risk weakening our immunity to the virus of tyranny. To fight coronavirus, we are all, to some degree, authoritarians now. So we are slowly emerging from hibernation. The lockdown is easing. We can visit friends and family again. Some of us around Australia are back at our favourite coffee shops, even gyms and swimming pools. Schools are open. Some states are slower to act than others. Victoria has endured a second round of the virus and another lockdown. But normal is a word we have begun to use again. There is even hope of a vaccine sooner rather than later. But will normal ever look the same? The virus has exposed our fragility. Businesses that have shut may never reopen. Those who have lost their jobs may never work again. Our democracy itself has been interrupted and may never look quite the same. The state-ordered lockdown and isolation to fight coronavirus reminds us of what Vladimir Tismanianu has called the frailty of liberal values. A swim in the beach or a coffee with friends are democracy's simple rewards. To lose these gentle pleasures loosens our grip on democracy itself. For it is in those quiet rituals of the everyday that we give our lives and our polity meaning. Democracy is delicate. It draws its strength from us. In the shared joys and common courtesies of daily life, we affirm to each other our allegiance. Coronavirus has not just threatened our health, it has threatened our way of life. Like those who have endured war and catastrophe, we may never be the same. It has been said that a pandemic is a social phenomenon with a medical aspect. Coronavirus, like previous pandemics, both reveals and accelerates. In this case, it has revealed the fragility of democracy and the looming threat of authoritarianism. Buried in his post-Cold War landmark study of democracy, The End of History and the Last Man, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote something that should make us all nervous. The totalitarian state, he wrote, it was believed could not only perpetuate itself indefinitely, it could replicate itself throughout the world like a virus. Yes, that word again, virus. Authoritarianism infects us where we are weakest, where we are most fearful, and it mutates and it spreads. This is a long way from Fukuyama's vision when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. As a young academic, he coined the phrase, the end of history, to describe what he saw as the triumph of liberal democracy. When the Soviet Union disintegrated a few short years later, Western liberal democracy appeared triumphant. To Fukuyama, the great ideological battles of humanity had been fought and won. Drawing on the 19th century philosopher Hegel, Fukuyama believed that history was the march towards freedom, and now history itself was at an end. As he wrote back then, authoritarianism was in crisis and only liberal democracy, the doctrine of individual freedom and popular sovereignty, remained as an ideology of potential universal validity. We had found, in Fukuyama's words, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, the final form of government, he wrote. Albert Camus, years before, though, had warned that the individual cannot accept history as it is. He must destroy reality, not collaborate with it, in order to affirm its own existence. If history had reached an end in 1989, then the Chinese Communist Party had not read about it. As the wall came down in Germany and the Soviet Union lurched towards collapse, China's supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping, ordered his troops to shoot down pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square. History had no sooner ended than it began again. We are at a hinge point of history now. To understand this, we need to take a snapshot of our world. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, there is talk of Cold War 2.0. The United States is staring down a new rival, China. We are witnessing a return of great power rivalry. Yet China is more powerful today than the Soviet Union was then, and the United States is unquestionably diminished. America is politically fractured. It is deeply divided along racial and class lines. It has an epidemic of gun violence and, of course, has been devastated by coronavirus. So damaged and polarized is the US that The Atlantic magazine in December 29 entitled its edition, "How to Stop a Civil War." Exaggeration or hyperbole? Perhaps. But then consider that The Atlantic magazine was founded in 1857 to campaign for the abolition of slavery just a few years before the Civil War of the 1860s. America today is worn down by war, tired and poorer. It is less sure of itself, and the world is less sure of American leadership. A decade ago, the journalist and political commentator Fareed Zakaria coined a phrase, the post-American world. He saw a world in which America was still powerful, but no longer dominant. Others had caught up. Is this the post-American world? China is on track to become the biggest economy in the world. It is building a military that it says will fight and win any war. In 2017, the US declared China a strategic competitor. And in 2019, the two big powers waged a trade war that damaged both nations. There are serious concerns that China and the US could be set on a course to even greater conflict. The battle plans are already being drawn up. Any clash between the US and China is potentially catastrophic. But as much as we may try to wish it away, right now, military strategists in Beijing and Washington are preparing for just such an eventuality. Global think tank, the Rand Corporation, prepared a report in 2015 for the American military. Its title could not have been more direct. War with China, thinking through the unthinkable. It concluded that China would suffer greater casualties than the US if war was to break out now. However, it cautioned that as China's military muscle increased, so would the prospect of a prolonged, destructive war. We know where the conflict would most likely start, in the South China Sea. Beijing has claimed disputed territory and already expanded it and militarized it. Air Force runways have been built on land dredged up from the ocean floor. Loudspeakers warn foreign ships to stay out of what China claims as its waters. American and Chinese warships sometimes come within meters of each other. This is our worst nightmare, an accident, a miscalculation that escalates beyond control. Some historians see an overlay with the drift to world war in 1914 or 1939. Writing about the lead up to the First World War, Christopher Clark, in his book Sleepwalkers, said that political leaders had become hostage to events. As he wrote, causes trawled from the length and breadth of Europe's pre-war decades are piled like weights on the scale until it tilts from probability to inevitability. Are the weights tipping the scales again? The Asia-Pacific is a tinderbox of old enmities, expanding militaries, disputed territories, unfinished conflicts, and nuclear-armed states. Founding Dean of the Harvard University Kennedy School and noted historian Graham Allison has looked back to 400 BC and the lessons of Thucydides, the historian of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The Thucydides trap, as it has become known, says that when a rising power meets a waning power, war becomes inevitable. Allison fears the world is lurching towards conflict unseen since World War II. In his book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap?, Allison writes, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable." Then it was Athens-Sparta. In 1914, it was Germany, Great Britain, and now China and the United States. As Allison writes, as far ahead as the eye can see, the defining question about global order is whether China and the US can escape Thucydides' trap. Most contests that fit this pattern have ended badly. On the current trajectory, Allison says war is not just possible, but much more likely than currently recognized. Now, a virus that came out of China has only added to our global instability. As Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison said, recently our world is poorer, more disorderly, and more dangerous. Reflecting this threat, Australia has updated its defence strategy significantly, increasing spending and investing in new weaponry. War, it must be said, is still unlikely, but we are not alone in preparing for what was not long ago unthinkable. Certainly the world is very different to the time of Thucydides, even compared to 1914. We are a more interconnected, economically entwined global community. Since the 1960s, peace in Asia has allowed unprecedented growth. Chinese scholar Wu Zhurong, in a 2015 article for Foreign Policy magazine called No Thucydides Trap, wrote of how globalization and the links between China and the US mitigates war. China, he wrote, seeks a modern relationship, a win-win scenario. In a speech in the United States in 2015, China's President Xi Jinping spoke of an opportunity for the two powers to boost global security, but he also issued this warning. Should they enter into conflict or confrontation, he said, it would lead to disaster for both countries and the world at large. How does Graham Allison answer his own question? Can America and China escape the Thucydides trap? He believes our fate depends on realism on all sides. Vital interests must be clearly defined. America must strengthen its democracy, and China address its failures of governance. Threats come from within. There is a need, he writes, for great thinkers to devise a grand strategy. Allison concludes with a quote not from Thucydides but Shakespeare. Our destiny lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. I can think of something else Shakespeare wrote in Macbeth. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. The turmoil of the world is set against a weakening democracy and a seemingly ascendant authoritarianism. Freedom House, an organisation that measures the health of democracy, now counts 13 straight years of declining freedom in the world. It says we are witnessing the return of the iron fist, the resurgence of political strongmen who seek to exploit fear and anxiety and govern over division. John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States and its second president, once said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, murders itself. There never was a democracy," he said, "that did not commit suicide." Is that what we are seeing in our time? Is this the inevitable death of democracy before it has even had time to truly grow old? It is only 30 years since Fukuyama's End of History. Is this where it has taken us? The second half of the 20th century was boom time for democracy. Germany emerged from the trauma of Nazism. South Africa threw off the yoke of apartheid. Decolonization across Africa and Asia created new, free, democratic nations, and in other parts of the world, Latin America and Europe, autocratic regimes were swept aside. Between 1970 and 2010, the number of democracies in the world increased from 35 to 120. According to Freedom House, 63% of the world lived in democracies. Democracy's appeal is obvious, as an essay in The Economist magazine in 2018 pointed out. Democracies are on average richer than non-democracies, are less likely to go to war and have a better record of fighting corruption. More fundamentally, democracy lets people speak their minds and shape their own and their children's futures. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. Yet today, what we have called the global liberal order is unraveling. Global politics was in a state of flux before COVID-19 escaped the Chinese province of Wuhan and put our lives into a tailspin. The past 2 decades has been a period of unending crisis, from the Al-Qaeda orchestrated terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, that sparked the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, to the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, to the Arab Spring that toppled Middle East dictators, to the rise of Islamic State, the relentless civil war in Syria. None of us has escaped unscathed. Terrorism has struck in cities from Paris to London to Jakarta to Sydney and Christchurch, New Zealand. People who lost their savings, their jobs, or their homes in the financial meltdown a decade ago still struggle to recover, and some never will. These shifting fault lines have exposed deep socio-economic inequalities, extant racial divisions, and simmering political antagonism. The Indian writer Pankaj Mishra has called this the age of anger. The Chinese-American lawyer and academic Amy Chua says this is the resurgence of tribalism. The old political left-right binary fails to explain fully what we are living through. This is the politics of identity: religion, race, ethnicity, nationalism. These are the drivers of our age. Immanuel Kant's idea of a perpetual peace of shared humanity and universal rights shatters against age-old enmity, historical grievance, and resentment. I'm reminded of the words of the great Irish poet William Butler Yates. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. As a reporter, I have traversed this world of intensity and hate. From bombed-out marketplaces in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq to the closed world of North Korea and the rise of the authoritarian behemoth of China, I have indeed followed the trail of blood where the ceremony of innocence is drowned. I have seen how identity excludes and shrinks our world, how it is weaponized. Hutu versus Tutsi in Rwanda, Catholic against Protestant in Northern Ireland, the Muslim blood feud of Shia and Sunni, Hindu against Muslim, on and on it goes. I have touched the outer limits of our humanity, and I can affirm one thing: the Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen, is right when he warns that identity can kill, and kill with abandon. Let me turn again to Yates. In his poem, The Rose Tree, he imagines a conversation between two Irish rebels, Pearse and Connolly. "But where can we draw water," said Pearse to Connolly, "when all the wells are parched away? Oh, plain as plain can be, there's nothing but our own red blood that can make a right rose tree." Nothing but our own red blood. This is the blood of vengeance and anger and grievance. It is the blood of identity poured through the strainer of history. Everywhere there is resurgent populism, nationalism, sectarianism, tribalism. All of it feeds on history. Think of what Xi Jinping tells the Chinese people. Remember the 100 years of humiliation by foreign powers. Or Vladimir Putin, who laments the end of the Soviet Empire as the great catastrophe of the 20th century. In Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan reminds his people of the greatness of the Ottoman Empire. In Hungary, Viktor Orban tells his people they were cheated after the end of World War I, when the country lost 2/3 of its territory and vows never again. Islamic State is still fighting the Crusades and dreams of rebuilding the caliphate for the final battle of humanity. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche told us we all suffer from a consuming historical fever. History, the vengeance of history, is the poison in the blood of our identities. Nietzsche warned of the man of ressentiment. His is the unquenchable thirst for revenge, the refusal to let go. Suffering, he said, forms the core of his identity. To Nietzsche, the man of ressentiment is a prisoner of his past, caught in a time warp. He returns always to the source of injustice that he cannot fix and does not want to fix. This toxic identity that has made our world so perilous has taken root too in democracies. As American political scientist Mark Liller says, spreading like a cancer. He says the politics of identity is shattering the idea of shared citizenship. The word "we," he says, has been banished to the outer reaches of respectable political discourse. Liller says this is a, quote, disastrous foundation for democratic politics. America, he writes, is in a moral panic about racial, gender and sexual identity that has distorted liberalism's message. At worst, it is pitting groups from the left and right into open and often violent conflict. In the United States, white supremacists have clashed with anti-fascist activists. In South Carolina, a young man named Dylan Roof walked into a black church and gunned down people in prayer. He was in the grip of that malignant historical fever, a man out of time, still fighting a long-dead war, a civil war America had to fight for its soul. In Christchurch, New Zealand, Muslim men and women are gunned down in prayer. In Paris, concert-goers at the Bataclan Theatre are slaughtered by people with a distorted, hateful view of faith. Islamic fundamentalists, white supremacists, right or left-wing extremists, they all drink from the same poisoned well. Those are the extreme examples of identity hate, yet they come from somewhere. They are born out of a world where we no longer see ourselves in each other. In democracies today, there are those who seek power through division, who revel in carnage and exploit fear and anxiety. They vow to return their people to some imagined golden age, while at the same time defining who are the true people, who belongs and who does not, who are the viruses to be cleansed. And these populists are often popular. They are seizing power with a simple, seductive message for people who are tired or angry or left out, left behind, and fearful. This is the state of democracies today, a competition for recognition and power that is rendering our polity fractured and unworkable. Rather than seek to build a coalition of interests, politicians and political parties appeal to a constellation of difference. We define ourselves not by what we are, but what we are not. Into this mix of great power rivalry, fear of war, rising authoritarianism, retreating democracy, political populism, nationalism, tribalism, and toxic weaponized identity, we now add coronavirus. This year has been unlike any other in our recent memories, a horrible year. We have experienced fear and vulnerability. Some have lost loved ones, others fallen ill, too many have lost their livelihoods, and we have all lost a little of our freedom. I spent a decade living and working in China, covering the story of this emerging authoritarian superpower. I felt what it was like to live in a country where the state controls information and movement, where the Communist Party reaches into every aspect of life. This year, all of us have felt a little of what life is like in China, monitored, suspicious of each other, liberty curtailed. The great strength of liberal democracy, freedom, has not been enough to defeat COVID-19. To beat the virus, we have had to surrender what is most precious to us. As China's President Xi Jinping boasts that his style of government is superior to the West, he could well ask, where is your freedom now? Of course, we can argue that state-enforced restrictions have been necessary, and our willingness to comply has indeed flattened the curve of the spread of the virus. But is this telling us something else? Is this also revealing the limits of liberal democracy built on freedom and individual liberty? The German political theorist and Nazi Party member Carl Schmitt, a critic of liberalism writing in the 1920s and 30s, argued that liberal governments are weak when faced with emergency. The technical nature of liberal constitutionalism, our checks and balances, he believed, left it unable to deal effectively with exceptional situations. In his book, Political Theology, Schmitt argued that the sovereign decides whether there is an extreme emergency. Communist dictatorship, he warned, was better positioned to deal with that exception. Why? Because that dictatorship itself was born out of emergency, revolution. Top-down state control is in the DNA of communism. As he wrote, everything is justified that appears to be necessary for a concretely gained success. Schmitt was writing against what he saw as the threat of communist Russia, and he believed only the Nazis could meet that threat. In the 1930s, Germany showed us how a cultured, intelligent, democratic nation can fall to tyranny. Prime Minister Morrison has likened our era to the 1930s, when a world gripped by depression saw the rise of fascism and the descent into catastrophic war. This is a bleak outlook, and these are bleak and testing times. Will democracy meet this challenge? America, the so-called beacon of democracy, whose Statue of Liberty offers haven to the poor, the tired, and the huddled masses, is a nation in crisis. Of all the nations in the world, it has been hit hardest by coronavirus. There is anger on the streets, deep divisions of class and race. America appears unsure of itself as the world is unsure of its future. Australia is not immune. Compared to other countries, we have escaped the worst of the virus. We are a rich, diverse, and democratic nation, but we are tested too. Our nation still fails the most vulnerable. The first people of this land still die 10 years younger than fellow Australians, are the most imprisoned and most impoverished people in the nation. We have never healed the wounds of our own history. We have never made good on recognising the place of Indigenous people. No treaties, no constitutional recognition. This is our task as other nations face their own. How do we build an idea of nationhood that embraces all of our identities, that does not pit one against each other, that recognises a common, shared citizenship in a nation where we feel equally recognised? The Uluru Statement from the Heart was an opportunity to build a better union, to unite Australians around a shared sense of belonging and injustice, but it remains still an opportunity lost. These are the challenges of our democracy, at a time when democracy everywhere is being challenged. Democracy is the best vaccine against tyranny. When the threat of coronavirus passes, we must reclaim our liberty. We must cherish it, and we must guard against those who would take it. What we have set aside in emergency, we must not allow to become normalised. We must push back against attempts at greater surveillance or control of our lives. Democracies united around common purpose made the world a better place after World War II. The world will need that collaboration, that commitment to a common future to ensure we meet the challenge of China without making China an enemy, to build stronger ties, to share our interests while not abandoning our values. 30 years ago, we declared the end of history, but history does not so easily end. The West was guilty of hubris and triumphalism, of thinking that countries like China would bend to our will. Now we are indeed at a hinge point of history, and the world we have known is no longer assured. We have felt the loss of freedom. Surely we know now how precious it is. Alexander Solzhenitsyn felt the brutality of the Soviet Union, banished to the Gulag, yet they could not take his soul. Even there, he found freedom and he found love. In his book, The Gulag Archipelago, he wrote of his first cell, first love. Of all the cells you've been in, he said, your first cell is a very special one. He told of how he would remember it all his life, just like a first love. His fellow cellmates, he said, were his family. It was not the dirty floor, he wrote, nor the murky walls, nor the odour of the latrine bucket that you loved, but those fellow prisoners, and that something that beat between your hearts and theirs. Solzhenitsyn said in that cell his soul would heal. That cell became not an abyss, but the most important turning point in his life. His words are majestic. They eschew all hate or revenge. They inspire courage in even the most timid soul. In the time of his greatest trial, he pulled humanity closer, not pushed it away. Now, for the first time, you are about to see people who were not your enemies, he wrote. Now, for the first time, you were about to see others who were alive, who were travelling your road, and whom you could join in yourself with the glorious word, we. In a world where we are putting up more borders and razor wire to keep people out, and identity has become a poisonous new faith, we need these words of Solzhenitsyn more than ever. Solzhenitsyn remembers the sound of the cell door opening for the first time, and 3 unshaven, crumpled, pale faces turning to him and smiling. He had forgotten what a smile was. "Are you from freedom?" they asked. Freedom, the greatest vaccine to tyranny.
Thank you so much for that, Stan. I'm sure this, the 25th annual history lecture, has given us all food for thought about the context of this current pandemic and about the importance of history in the present day. As Stan has pointed out, history provides us with a way to understand what might happen but it also gives us a moment to stop and breathe, to see these bleak and testing times with a clarity about how history can sometimes make us seek vengeance rather than justice. The theme of History Week, What is History Good For?, makes us think about how politics, as Stan has pointed out, feeds on history. I thank you, Stan, for a powerful lecture on how we might use rather than abuse history. The annual history lecture will be available on the History Council website within the next couple of days and later broadcast as a radio program on ABC Radio National. Please do check the History Council's newsletter and social media channels for more details. And please do visit the website of the History Week program of events. Again, thank you, Stan, and thank you all for attending tonight's annual history lecture. Good night.